Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just briefly introduce who I am and where I'm from. D'Artagnan Pacific, or D'Artagnan Consulting, is I'd say, very small boutique consulting firm which is headquartered in the United States. I lead the Australia-New Zealand practice, but I live in the UK as well. So I spend about half my time in this part of the world, and we've been assisting with various governments, New Zealand and in Australia, with various aspects of road pricing and road user charging. As a result, what this presentation is focusing on is about urban road pricing. Road pricing can mean a lot of things. I've got a blog called Road Pricing, and I've tried to define the various ways people use the term. So here I'm talking about urban road pricing on existing roads. So I'm not including tolls in the traditional sense. I'm not including urban access control schemes, of which there are many, pure environmental-based charges, and I'd say very small charging schemes that are effectively a form of access control. I'm also not counting network-based heavy vehicle charging, or indeed the other innovation in the US, which is piloting full network charging of light vehicles as a way to replace fuel tax. So I'm not going to talk about those things. My focus is upon the major urban road pricing schemes around the world, and I've highlighted here a map of the ones that I think are relevant in this context. Now, there are some obvious gaps there. North America has hot lanes, but I don't count that as being in the same vein as urban road pricing, because people do have other choices. And if I was to layer on top of this map all the cities that had investigated urban road pricing and had come close to it, I'd have to blow Europe up quite a bit, because we can think of Amsterdam and Copenhagen, several, Edinburgh, Manchester. And so the likelihood of success is not as high as the likelihood of failure when you get these things wrong. And I think some of the dimensions around what we're talking about today and tomorrow are about building acceptability, but also designing schemes and packages of schemes that address the sorts of concerns that ultimately can determine failure at the political level and at the public level. So what are the main impacts? And there are 4 primary impacts, not 3. The first one is to shift travel by time of day. So people choose not to drive at the times of charging, or they change from a highly priced time to a lower priced time. The second is to shift travel by mode. We all know this. The third may be to shift travel by route, and there are examples of schemes which provide people either an uncharged bypass, or there may be a parallel route. And the fourth one is to consolidate or reduce total travel demand. These are trips that on appearance just disappear. Now, the point here is that when you introduce a charging scheme, the evidence on shifting from travel by car to public transport is relatively easy to obtain. The example of Stockholm, it was easy to count reduction of car trips, and then there was about half of those went on to public transport. There was an increase in public transport trips. What happened to the other 50% is there is almost no idea. And the evidence there was that if you took surveys longer than a few weeks out from introducing the scheme, people couldn't remember what they were doing before. And how do you survey people who are no longer doing something? How did you know they were doing it in the first place? It becomes a difficult statistical and research exercise to find out why people are no longer doing something or what they are doing. And this is where understanding what has happened when people choose not to drive and not go by another mode is a big question. So what is the fundamental challenge about urban road pricing? It is those who benefit versus those who pay. And those who pay either benefit explicitly, they have a high value of time, what they pay is lower than what they benefit from. They may benefit implicitly, where the value of time may not explicitly, it may appear that they have a lower value of time than they actually do, and they choose to pay, and their own perception is that what they get out of that saving is worth more than what they pay. And then there are those who don't benefit but pay anyway, because the consequences of them not paying are far more serious than, than not taking the trip. And this is an example where people have a net loss, so they pay to drive under an urban pricing scheme. Their travel time savings are not worth it, but if they don't take that trip, they may lose their job. The other half of the equation are those who don't pay, and they may continue the trip by another means, route, or time of day. They may cancel a discretionary trip, which is largely seen as a good thing, or they may cancel a high-value trip. And this is the real fundamental concern, is will an urban road pricing scheme price people out of doing essential trips, and therefore have quite significant social impacts? Now, elaborating on this more, conventional benefit cost analysis would tend to average value of time. We've had a discussion about value of time already, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. So there are some who obviously benefit very highly from it, and you do analysis of the impact of a road pricing scheme, and there'll be groups that benefit very well, and there are others that are net losers. I've been involved in some of the analysis in the UK for schemes that haven't gone ahead, and it's a very simple piece of analysis that has said, look, commercial road users, they benefit from it, people doing business trips benefit, and others do not. And so the net impact is, depending upon the profile of trips, can be quite negative. But my second point, and this has already been alluded to, is that the imputed values of time are not real. And some people are willing to pay for travel time savings based upon specific trip characteristics, and this was in fact my earlier point. And whether it be urgency, it may be comfort, so how people value money for one purpose may be different from how they value money for another purpose, and their own scarcity of time. And I think the US toll lanes demonstrate part of that, but I think it would also be demonstrated in a full scheme. The scheme design can also mean that some pay with no net benefits. That's not just about value of time. If a scheme is designed fairly bluntly, there will be people who pay to cross a charging point that isn't very congested, that they take a trip that is largely on uncongested roads, but they're paying. What are they getting from that? It's certainly not a net benefit. And I think all schemes have had this limitation to some extent. Singapore is the example where it's sufficiently highly refined that Singapore has managed to largely avoid that characteristic. And the last point is that with simple schemes, they will tend to overprice the shorter trips, going over a charging point compared to longer trips. And that's just simply a function of the scheme. If a simple scheme is trying to capture a lot of radial trips into a centre, those who travel the longest are paying the same as those who take a short trip. Now, I've put the example of Gothenburg up here, and I'm not trying to specifically pick on Gothenburg, but I think there are some characteristics around the Gothenburg scheme that stand out in terms of its impact and its design. And the original problem in Gothenburg was focused upon that little image on the northeastern corner as being the pinch points in the network. But the Gothenburg scheme was not designed to resolve the most serious congestion in Gothenburg. It was designed to also raise a lot of revenue. And so the cordon was designed to meet that target and that purpose, and that's fine, that is a policy purpose. So it operates all day long, and Gothenburg really didn't have congestion during the off-peak period, but it did charge for congestion. And so in that sort of environment, the number of people who pay the Gothenburg scheme versus those who benefit is much, much higher. It's a high ratio of those who pay compared to those who benefit. And this diagram, which is from a study not long after it was introduced, seems to illustrate that. On the left-hand side, these are income classes. On the left-hand side, it shows that those on the lowest incomes had the greatest losses from the scheme. And those who benefited even those who benefited the most were still not net beneficiaries. And it basically looks a very regressive way to raise revenue. This is what it starts to resemble. It has a a positive impact on congestion. There's no doubt it had positive transport impacts. But given its purpose was about revenue generation, there'd be questions to ask about what its social impacts were. Another element of this, which I don't think is often thought about, is if we think about the urban road pricing schemes more generally and what is done with the revenue, most of the schemes that are to be funded by the Gothenburg project are not completed. So people are paying for the construction costs of projects that they are unable to use. So the benefits of the spending simply haven't been realised yet. An alternative model would have been to borrow money, build the schemes, and then set up the charge to recover that at a time when people had the option to use mostly public transport, also some road schemes. So of those who don't pay, our big concern is about the lost trips. These are the trips where we don't know where people have gone. And clearly, if people change their behaviour by mode, route or time of day, theoretically they have losses, but these are acceptable because it's not a huge cost for them to have gone from driving to going by public transport. We can assume that. But the key focus of these schemes is to remove the discretionary trips at times of peak congestion, so that people look at the value of their trip at that time and decide, well, no, I'm not prepared to, now that I've got this cost, I'm not prepared to drive at that time, and that then relieves the roads for those who have a higher value of time. But what about those who don't have a reasonable alternative? And I think the bigger concern about that is during the initial years of a scheme. Over the long run, an urban road pricing scheme can be expected to change the urban form of a city. It'd probably be fair to say, I don't think there have been schemes around for long enough on such a scale that you can really see that impact to date. Singapore has been around for a long time, but Singapore's scheme is wrapped up in a lot of packages of other measures that trying to separate out the electronic road pricing element from all of the other measures is very difficult. Conversely, London's scheme has been around since 2003, but London's scheme is so tightly focused. The proportion of car users in London who ever drove into the central zone is so low that London's scheme almost reflected what was already happening in London anyway in terms of trip patterns. It took out some discretionary trips of car users during the day in central London, but it hasn't made I don't think the impacts on urban form in London are in any way significant or possibly even measurable. But in a city such as Auckland, it would have a much more direct impact depending upon the type of scheme that you introduce. In the long run, you could expect people to change where they live and where they work and what they do depending on a scheme. But in the short term, the impacts, particularly on those with low incomes, with fewer choices, are likely to be more significant. So what are the mitigation approaches that can be taken for schemes? The first one, and I think actually the most important one to start off with, is to refine the scheme design. Target the problem. If it is about congestion pricing, you need to target congestion where and when it happens. And the blunter that a scheme design is, the less it is doing that, the more it is going to be charging people who are not experiencing congestion. They are simply not going to benefit from the scheme by the scheme design, not by other characteristics. Now, Singapore, again, I think is easily the best example of a scheme that has targeted congestion by location and time and even vehicle type. The blunter the scheme, the more people are going to be captured by the scheme inadvertently. And I think that technology is enabling that to be done more efficiently and more effectively than it used to be. The second one is enhancing the supply of alternatives, and public transport and active modes are the obvious alternatives in this. In some cases, it's about bypass routes, but I also think there's an element of time shift. And this is part of scheme design, but allowing, if there is going to be charging of peak and off-peak, to have gradations of charging, so it isn't just you're hit with paying $5 or $10 or euros or pounds or whatever, but to have the ability to make a time shift of half an hour, pay less but still have access. The third one is to have targeted discounts and exemptions, and I'll get into that later. That has its issues, but it's certainly a useful tool for those who are particularly disadvantaged. And the fourth one is to recycle the revenue that's generated and reduce other forms of charges or taxes that people face. And that's an example which has rarely been used to date. What I have on this table here is a blunt depiction of the degree to which these various tools have been used, and I think the six most significant schemes of this type. Now, Singapore, as I said, has been the one that's been most focused on targeting congestion, and I'd argue Dubai wasn't, because it was fairly clear when the Dubai scheme was introduced, and you might argue as to whether that was a congestion management scheme or a toll, but there wasn't the need for revenue, and it was sold as being about congestion. But a series of charging points were put in, and the day after, people were just rerouting onto other locations. It didn't seem to be very well refined in terms of targeting congestion. The London scheme, equally, the London scheme was a logical location, but it was hardly very refined. It's a one flat fee all day long, regardless of how much road space you're consuming during that day. Most schemes have put quite a lot of effort into alternatives. I think it's probably, I should have another tick for Gothenburg. I think that was a bit unfair, but I mean, Dubai had no alternatives and has since introduced the metro scheme. But I think that there is a great deal of experience in putting in modal choices. Discounts and exemptions are an interesting one. I think London's had the highest proportion of discount and exempt vehicles, but that's not largely about distributional social impact purposes. That has been around, on one level, lobbying from certain sectors, and I think that the taxi industry obviously were essential in getting buy-in for the London scheme early on, and they form a significant proportion of vehicles that circulate in central London. There are other discounts and exemptions for purposes such as electric vehicles and green vehicles, but the important distributional ones are around access for the disabled. I think there are other schemes that have very low levels of discounts and exemption. I think Singapore would easily have the lowest, but given that the effort is put into targeting the problem, you could argue that there's less of a concern there. And there are wider, I think, car ownership and urban form factors in Singapore that would say that the need for discounts and exemption would be much less. But the last point in terms of reducing other charges is that there's almost no experience in that whatsoever. I've put Singapore there because there was an offsetting change to the taxation and ownership regime for owning a car in Singapore when its scheme was put in place. It's not significant, but that is one. There was an offset in terms of owning a car in Singapore when it was introduced, but none of the other schemes have directly sought to reduce either motoring taxes or general taxes for those who pay the scheme. So what worked and what didn't? I'd argue that Singapore and Gothenburg have almost been opposites in terms of targeting the problem, and the basic reason for that was Gothenburg wasn't targeting congestion. Gothenburg was targeting a revenue target, with congestion being almost a secondary reduced externality benefit from it. But clearly, the more refined the scheme, the fewer users will be inadvertently charged for little to no travel time savings. Most schemes to date have focused on radial trips to central areas, so public transport alternatives have been, I think, critical. And the importance of bypass routes depends on the scheme geography. But back to a point that was being alluded to before, when you get to non-radial trips, there are fewer modal alternatives, and the ability of public transport to provide choices for those taking orbital trips is very, very limited indeed. I think discounts and exemptions can be highly effective in targeting small, easy to define, and by control I mean groups that you can restrict access to as that discount group, such as the disabled. But there are a lot of care needs to be taken to minimise the risk of fraud. I mean, you create a discount group, people may well find ways to classify themselves into that discount group. The experience in the UK around the disabled blue badge scheme has been a great deal of concern around fraud, where people may sign up a relative's vehicle. You can sign up for that scheme a relative who takes you as a disabled person on particular trips. So that relative now has basically unfettered access to parking and the congestion charge. When you might argue that that's perhaps not a particularly good use of that scheme. And the other element is that it may undermine the scheme objectives. Now, again in London is now approaching 50% of the vehicles in the charging zone do not pay, or they have a 90% discount, including the residence discount. The travel time speeds in central London are now roughly similar to what they were before the congestion charge was introduced. So there has been growth in the discounted exempt traffic to such an extent, and it's not the only reason, but it's a considerable reason that it has undermined the success of the scheme. And now London is starting to talk about the next stage, which goes much, much wider into network charging. My fourth point about what worked and what didn't around offsetting other charges and taxes is there simply is little experience of this. And there is probably a lot of opportunity to think about how that can be done. Clearly, if there was discussion about changing the infrastructure funding model and charging of vehicles, such as with fuel excise and RUC, that could provide a tool to offset that. In a purely urban environment, when that is off the table, you can raise questions around local taxation, local property taxes, other incentives around public transport, and I think there's scope to have a discussion about what these could be. But those sorts of instruments and what you use the money for could well be quite useful. And onto the unintended consequences. Clearly the targeting of congestion has dynamic impacts. So if a scheme is going to target congestion where and when it occurs, it needs to be prepared to review the charges at that point, what times those charges operate and what those charge levels are. And realistically, until the scheme has actually been introduced and tried at each individual point, you don't know what that's like. Singapore is very refined in this respect. It has grown its scheme over many years and is quite sophisticated in how it manages reviewing the charges at each of its charging points. The second unintended consequence is being clear about what the supply of alternatives can do. And I have here an example in London was that one of the other reasons why travel times have reduced in central London is that the reallocation of road space to support the alternatives has made conditions worse for those who are paying to use the scheme. Now, there hasn't been a lot of talk about freight, but freight is the mode that doesn't really have does not have modal shift choice. It may have time of day choice up to a point, but when you have a